Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a weekly wrap-up of 3 books. Yi-Yun Lee's Must I Go, her latest novel which came out recently. The Endless Short Story by Ronald Sukenick. And Jesus' Son, a collection of short stories by Denis Johnson. So I'm going to start with the Yi-Yun Lee. It's quite a hard book to talk about really, in that there's some beautiful, lots and lots of beautiful writing in it. But it's still a slog. Now it's not a slog because the language was particularly difficult, it's a slog because of the structure, and I'll come to explain what I mean by that, because I have to talk about what it's about in order to get to that. So Lilia, or Lilia, it's hard to know exactly how to pronounce it, as there are several names in this book that are quite hard to pronounce, is 81 years old, living in a sort of retirement home of old people. And she's casting back on her life using the device of a self-published memoir by a former lover of hers called Roland, who seduced her on her family sort of tourist ranch when she was 16. And they had a brief time together, and then obviously it was the end of his holiday. And they met again a couple of times, but basically that was it. But quite clearly, this guy was the love of her life, even though she herself went on to have 3 husbands, who all died on her, 5 kids, and lots of grandchildren. But one of her kids, called Lucy, committed suicide, and thereby Lila came to bring up Lucy's young daughter, Catherine. So what this book is, ostensibly, is it's Lila in this old people's home, reading through these memoirs that were published after Roland had died, casting back on her life, and sort of projecting things onto Roland, onto Roland's lovers, and casting back on her own life accordingly. And she's leaving it as a record for Catherine and Catherine's daughter, her own granddaughter, great-granddaughter, Iola. And that's essentially what the book is. And it is very aphoristic. There's some fantastic observations about human beings, human relationships, love, marriage, death. But it's a slog because once you reach the Roland's memoirs, you get a section of Roland's original memoir quoted, and then you get Lila's comments on it and projections, where she's either projecting it to something about her relationship with her suicided daughter Lucy, or one of her husbands, or her relationship with Roland, who, don't forget, she had a relationship with him when he was 16, but beyond that didn't really have much to do with him. And also, we get a lot from Roland's point of view. He too is all about sort of secret affairs and everything. First of all, he's a philanderer extraordinaire. So first of all, he has a crush on an older aunt of his, and then that gets transposed to a woman called Sidel Ogden, who's older than him, and is a poet, and is his love of his life. She's married. He's carrying on an affair with her. But, Sidel Ogden never met Lila, and yet Lila's projecting all this sorts of stuff on Sidel and relating it back to her own life, which is unsatisfactory. But the problem is as I say, you get Roland's bit, then Lila's bit, then Roland's bit, then Lila's sort of, analysis of it, and it's really plodding. It's really hard work to get through it, because it's just someone making a lot of notes in the margin, really. And she's leaving this, as I say, for her granddaughter Catherine and her great-granddaughter Lola. So the aphorisms are beautiful and poignant and observant, but all taken all together, it's a slog to read, and I didn't get on with it. Roland is a horrendous character. It's hard to know why any woman fell for him. All right, Lila was 16 years old. She was quite vulnerable potentially, but, the only really interesting character is Sidel Ogden, who is, I said it was aphoristic, and at times she borders on sort of Oscar Wilde sort of, repartee in this, as, sort of the younger Roland throws up this observation and she sort of bats it away and undermines it and cuts him down with some witty barb or, clever observational barb. So she is interesting if mysterious. Roland is just, totally unlikable, and I can't see why half of this book focuses on him, because he's not worth it. By his own admission, he was cowardly, he's a wastrel, he gets by with, without ever really having a career. He imagines he'll be a novelist, but admits that he hasn't got the gumption or the talent for it. Eventually he marries this woman called Hetty, who's a cousin of his, who's had an unrequited love for him ever since they were children or young adults. But she's utterly, self-sacrificing in her devotion to Roland. So she's not a very interesting character, even though towards the end Lila ascribes her sort of strength and more subtlety than just being a sort of, stooge for Roland. So as I say, there's only one interesting character here. And, Lila, when she's talking about the past, she is quite interesting. And it's good that, an 81-year-old woman is still thinking in terms of her sort of, her sexual being. And that was good. But when she's sort of responding to her surroundings and events in the old people's home, it makes me think, in the same sense that I don't like stories narrated by children, I almost don't like stories narrated by old people in old people's homes, because they sort of succumb to blandishments and very uninteresting observations. Lila is clearly more intelligent than anyone else in this retirement home, but she's kind of dragged down to their level. But the writing is dragged down to that level in that it's only when she's looking back and she's a vibrant sexual being, whereas as an 81-year-old, all that is gone. And that's always how old people are portrayed, what their past lives that they can't recollect, lay claim to and stuff. So all in all, I found this really frustrating. I gave it 3.5 stars, mainly because of the quality of the writing, which I just want to give some examples, because it is beautifully written. So this is an entry in Roland's memoir. I'm not sure from what year, but it's probably pre-Second World War. The summer, already empty, became more so. There are plenty of girls in town, plenty of dances and picnics. The fleet will arrive, adding fresh Navy officers. But Hetty and I, 2 old people living in our young shells, will let routine carry us. I am suffering from the internal bleeding caused by despair. Hetty, the anaemia caused by love. So that's what I mean. This book is chock full of aphorisms like that, which are wonderful. Here's another one. I imagine she was forgiven in the end. People forgive her. Some people inspire admiration, others pity, others annoyance. She inspires forgiveness. What about you? Or perhaps I was going to say, what about me? Either way, I cut myself off in time. The truly dangerous people are those who inspire a mix of everything. Those are the people you must avoid. Why? When someone inspires a mix of things in you, you'd mistakenly think of yourself as being in love. Do you not agree? So again, that aphoristic thing is brilliant, but the structure of the book unfortunately cuts against that. It's not a page turner, because it's going to be more of the same. That is the problem. So again, this is from Roland's. This is Lila's commentary on something that Roland had written. An affair. It didn't sound like this woman was ever interested in any man, and she was dying now. Was she cheating on her husband or on her death? I suspect Roland sometimes revised his diaries for dramatic effect. Perhaps playing a rival to her husband was not enough for Roland. He had to create one episode in which he was more powerful than the Grim Reaper. And I found this interesting. This is sort of 2/3 of the way through. This is Lila commenting on the experience of reading his diaries. Rabbit after rabbit after rabbit. I'm glad I made this decision to skip a little in his book. I can't possibly comment on every page. It's like one person always writing too much in his letters and the other running out of words to reply. This morning I wondered whether another person reading Roland's diaries would be as patient patient with him as I am. But who would read him? Not a random stranger. Anyone who reads him would have already made some allowance for him. Had Roland died before Hetty, she might have kept to his wishes and printed the 3 volumes as he had planned, rather than cutting them down. Would she have read them? Unlikely. Would she at least have done something to surprise the world, like going through his address book and sending a copy of the diaries to every woman in it, or making a bonfire of all the copies she printed? There is no point in thinking about how Roland would look in a stranger's eyes. Well, yeah, I agree. Roland isn't interesting enough to me as a stranger, even though obviously he's fictional. You know, we're all strangers to Roland, who doesn't exist. But she sort of lays out exactly how I felt as a reader, that I'm not interested in his journal entries. Sometimes I'm interested in Lilia's responses to them, but sometimes they seem a stretch too far, because she never knew Seidel. She didn't know Roland in the majority of his life after their affair when she was 16. She's now 81. She can legitimately sort of read his memoirs, sort of say, yes, that's how I remember him, or no, that's not how, he wasn't like that towards me. But there's a whole side of him that she can't possibly have experienced, you know, face to face. So, yeah, not very satisfying, really. And on to Denis Johnson, Jesus' Son, a collection of short stories. So a couple of years ago I read his short stories, The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, and what struck me was the variety of not just tone but theme and approach and everything. These stories are very much of a piece, very much of a tone, and it's marginal people in America, so it's quite grim. Junkies, addicts, drunks, gamblers, thieves, people out on bail from prison, barflies. You know, in a way it's the world of Bukowski, although I infinitely prefer Johnson to Bukowski, I have to say. The first story is very good. It's about a hitchhiker who's recounting the 4 lifts that he'd received that day, and then you realise the 4th one ends up in a massive car accident in a family car with a family in it. So that was good. And then we have a really good story, I think, called 2 Men. I'm just going to read the start of that. Once again, I hated the 2 of them. The 3 of us had formed a group based on something erroneous, some basic misunderstanding that hadn't yet come to light, and so we kept on in one another's company, going to bars and having conversations. Generally, one of these false coalitions died after a day, or a day and a half, but this one had lasted more than a year. Later on, one of them got hurt when we were burglarising a pharmacy, and the other 2 of us dropped him bleeding at the back entrance of the hospital, and he was arrested, and all the bonds were dissolved. We bailed him out later, and still later all the charges against him were dropped, but we'd torn open our chests and shown our cowardly hearts, and you can never stay friends after something like that. You know, that is absolutely symptomatic of Johnson's brilliant writing. But that story goes on in an interesting way, because one of the narrator is sort of kissing a woman in the sort of outside of a bar, and her then boyfriend comes across them, and he gets really paranoid that the boyfriend's going to come after him, you know, once they've all gone their separate ways. It's going to come after him looking for revenge. And then that gets mixed with the 3 of them, you know, the 3 friends, or the group of 3 that from that piece I read out. They pick up this deaf and dumb guy who wants to go home. He keeps taking to these places where he's clearly known, but he can't gain access to until the last one, where it's some sort of crack house. And it's just really evocative and powerful writing. And my favourite story was called Emergency, which is set in a hospital between a guy who is an administrator and a guy who's essentially a porter and a cleaner, you know, keeps the wards clean and sterile. And they both pop pills to get through the night shift and things like that. And they go on a sort of a journey which gets sort of quite sort of spiritual, and you know, the landscape absolutely takes them over. That was a really, really good story, and I suppose had a slightly sort of more uplifting tone to it. But all in all, I found it slightly disappointing that all the stories are of a piece. I mean, it does throw open the question about what do you want from a collection of short stories. Do you want them all thematically linked to either, as I say, in theme or in tone, so that there's some linkage between them? in which case you then begin to think, well, why not write a novel? Or do you want them as The Largesse of the Sea Maiden was, where they were completely different in everything, tone, style, etc. And I don't have a definitive preference or answer on that. But, you know, maybe it's just because you know, the characters in here and their lives are quite grim that I didn't quite respond as you know, gushingly as I did to The Largesse of the Sea Monster. But still brilliant writing. So I gave this 4. And finally, Ronald Sukenick, again, I describe as one of that sort of first wave of American postmodernist writers from the 60s. He was writing in the 80s and 90s, along with people like Curtis White. This is the 3rd Sukenick book I've read, and it started off in the vein of, you know, each section is you know, doesn't seem connected at all to the previous section. The characters aren't the same, and you think, where are we going with this? But then there are 2 fairly central chapters, one after the other. You know, it's called the endless short story, and in a sense, it is a book about the impossibility of writing a perfectly formed story of any kind with sort of through flow for the characters. So the first of the 2, what I take to be significant chapters, sees a character, a female character, in this section, who knows she's a fictional character, having a conversation with the author, who also seems to be a fictional character in it. So it veers very nicely between fictional characters, but also characters outside of the fiction, in the sense of the author who's writing this. And they're just sort of shooting the breeze about relationships with different people, with each other, and just trying to place them sort of definitively. And because you're not quite sure at what level of reality it's happening, is it purely a sort of internal postmodernist thing? Are they 100% fictional characters? Or is there, you know, this sort of reverberation, this resonance with the producer of the fiction? So that was quite interesting. And the other was really, really interesting as well, in that all the characters are referred to only by a letter of the alphabet that starts their name. And all the place names are like sort of map grid references, like in the old A to Z, although obviously this is set in America. They used to have the A to Z sort of guide to sort of streets, and it would be a grid reference. And so there's nothing sort of specific or spelt out, which increases the sense of the haphazard and random nature of people bumping into people or going to meet people, and then someone hasn't turned up because they're at another venue. And that was really, really effective, and makes you think about events in novels, you know, and are they happenstance? Are they random and accidental? Well, of course they're not, because an author is working very hard, very deliberately, to build up the series of events that populate the novel. So, but that was really interesting and quite subversive, I thought. So that pulled this novel round, so that I gave it sort of 3.5. I really would give it 3.75, which is a bit of an odd mark, because it is kind of more of the same from Sukenick, and also more of the same from postmodernist writers. But I was impressed with that central sort of pair of chapters. So there you have it. That's my reading for this week. Quite disappointing, must I go? Yu Yin Lee. Yeah. Denis Johnson, you know, hitting the mark, but with certain limitation on my part. Jesus' Son. And Ronald Sukenick, The Endless Short Story. For this week, I will be reading Ali Smith's final book in her quartet, Summer. That'll be my main read for this week. I don't think I've got anything ongoing. No, so if I finish that within the week, I'll be looking forward to some non-fiction, which will be Blake Butler's book on insomnia called Nothing. So I'm looking forward to giving that a whirl. Just a reminder, and I'll post the link in the box, that I've got an ongoing book giveaway which I'm running throughout September. So please go and check out the video, see if you fancy any of the 10 plus books that I'm giving away. There is an ongoing chance for a Q&A because I've reached 1,000 subscribers, and I've got a new novel coming out next spring. I've had a brilliant response to that so far, so much so that while I'm keeping the option open for people to post questions, I'm probably going to go with what I've got for at least one video and make that and if more questions come in after that before the end of September, I'll make a second video. But I've had some wonderful questions in, and I think I've got enough for quite a a full video to begin with. So we'll see where that leads. But I will be recording at least my first part of answering the Q&A. Okay, so till next time, thanks very much.